Cancer as a weapon. Poppy Bush, George W. Bush. Poppy Bush's radioactive war in Iraq. At the close of the First Gulf War, Saddam Hussein was denounced as a ferocious villain for ordering his retreating troops to destroy Kuwaiti oil fields. Again, which, as I reported last week, was done by U.S. Special Forces, not Saddam Hussein. Clouding the air with poisonous clouds of black smoke and saturating the ground with swamps of crude. It was justly called an environmental war crime. Again, demonized Saddam, who was a bad individual, no question, but who armed him initially with chemical weapons which he used on parts of his population, and who did the oil fields, who actually blew the oil fields. I covered that last week. U.S. Special Forces. Report continues, but months of bombing of Iraq by U.S. and British planes and cruise missiles have left behind an even more deadly and insidious legacy. Tons of shell casings, bullets, and bomb fragments laced with depleted uranium. In all, the U.S. hit Iraqi targets with more than 970 radioactive bombs and missiles. It took less than a decade for the health consequences from this radioactive bombing campaign to begin to come into focus, and they are dire indeed. Iraqi physicians call it the White Death, leukemia. Since 1990, the incident rate of leukemia in Iraq has grown exponentially. The situation is compounded by Iraq's forced isolations and the sadistic sanctions regime recently described by UN Secretary General as a humanitarian crisis. That makes detection and treatment of the cancers all the more difficult. Let's stop there for a moment to remember former U.S. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright stating on the record when asked if she thought the sanctions that were attributed to killing 500,000 Iraqi children was worth it, and she said yes. That's the mentality of those in our government. Back to the bombs instituted by George W. Bush and the ongoing death toll from it, just like Agent Orange in Vietnam. The report continues. The desert dust carries death, said Dr. Jawad Al-Ali, an oncologist and member of England's Royal Society of Physicians. Quote, our studies indicate that more than 40% of the population around Basra will get cancer. 40%. We are living through another Hiroshima, he stated. Most of the leukemia and cancer victims aren't soldiers. They are civilians, and many of them are children. The U.S. dominated Iraqi sanctions committee in New York has denied Iraq's repeated requests for cancer treatment equipment and drugs, even painkillers such as morphine. As a result, the overflowing hospitals in towns such as Basra are left to treat the cancer-stricken victims with aspirin. This is a part of the larger horror inflicted on Iraq that sees as many as 180 children dying every single day, according to mortality figures compiled by UNICEF. Iraqis and Kuwaitis aren't the only ones showing signs of uranium contamination and sickness. Gulf War veterans plagued by a variety of illnesses have been found to have traces of uranium in their blood, feces, urine, and semen. Depleted uranium is a benign-sounding name for uranium-238, the trace elements left behind when the fissionable material is extracted from uranium-235 for use in nuclear reactors as weapons. For decades, this waste was a radioactive nuisance, piling up at plutonium processing plants across the country. By the late 1980s, there was nearly 1 billion tons of this material. Then, the weapons designers at the Pentagon came up with a use for the tailings. They could be molded into bullets and bombs. The material was free, and there was plenty at hand. Also, uranium is a heavy metal, denser than lead. This makes it perfect for use in armored penetrating weapons designed to destroy tanks, armored personnel carriers, and bunkers. While the tank-busting bombs explode, the depleted uranium oxidizes into microscopic fragments that float through the air like carcinogenic dust, carried on the desert winds for decades. Remember the earlier report about the particles being found? That's the tip of the iceberg, and these particles are now floating indefinitely through our atmosphere as well. The lethal dust is inhaled, sticks to the fibers of the lungs, and eventually begins to wreak havoc on the body. Tumors, hemorrhages, ravaged immune systems, and leukemias. In 1943, the doomsday men associated with the Manhattan Project speculated that uranium and other radioactive materials could be spread across wide swaths of land to contain opposing armies. General Leslie Grove, head of the project, asserted that uranium weapons could be expected to cause, quote, permanent lung damage, end quote. In the late 1950s, Al Gore's father, the senator from Tennessee, proposed dousing demilitarized zones in Korea with uranium as a cheap, fail-safe against an attack from North Koreans, permanently contaminating parts of the world. Keep that in mind. Continuing with the report, after the Gulf War, Pentagon war planners were so delighted with the performance of their radioactive weapons that they ordered a new arsenal, and under Bill Clinton's orders, fired them at Serb positions in Bosnia, Kosovo, and Serbia. More than 100 of the DU bombs have been used in the Balkans over the last 6 years. Already, medical teams in the region have detected cancer clusters near the bomb sites. The leukemia rate in Sarajevo, which again was carpeted by American DU bombs in '96, has increased exponentially. The Pentagon has shuffled through a variety of rationales and excuses. First, the Defense Department shrugged off concerns about depleted uranium as wild conspiracy theories by peace activists, environmentalists, and Iraqi propagandists. When the U.S.'s NATO allies demanded that the U.S. disclose the chemical and metallic properties of its munitions, the Pentagon refused. It has also refused to order testing of U.S. soldiers stationed in the Gulf and the Balkans. If the U.S. has kept silent, the Brits haven't. In 1991, a study by the UK Atomic Energy Authority predicted that if less than 10% of the particles released by depleted uranium weapons used in Iraq and Kuwait were inhaled, it could result in as many as 300,000 probable deaths. Very conservative figure. The British estimate assumed that the only radioactive ingredient in the bombs dropped on Iraq was depleted uranium, but in fact it wasn't. A new study of the materials inside these weapons describes them as, quote, a nuclear cocktail containing a mix of radioactive elements including plutonium and the highly radioactive isotope uranium-236. These elements are 100,000 times more dangerous than depleted uranium. Depleted uranium has a half-life of more than 4 billion years, the approximate age of the Earth. Massive swaths of land in the Balkans, Kuwait, and southern Iraq have been contaminated forever. And these particles aren't staying there. They're blowing around the globe where we all get to inhale them. And nanoparticulates from countless sources, including what I have just gone over, including climate engineering, most specifically, are raining down through the air column where we all get to breathe them in. This is happening. It's not my opinion. It's not theory. It's not conjecture. It's not hypothesis. It's fact. Not believing this fact won't save you from the fact. Understand that. So let's consider if George Bush Sr. and Dick Cheney and Colin Powell and Bill Clinton and Obama and the rest, every occupant of the White House as well, want a legacy. This is their legacy. And I hear this so often. Why would they do this to themselves? How many things have they done to themselves and all the rest of us in the entire planet because we are not dealing with sanity? So for those that still believe the power structure manufactured lie that the populations in other countries have great disdain for America because of our freedoms, please face the truth. So many in other countries hate the U.S. because of what the U.S. military and the militaries of our allies have done to their countries, have done to them, and have done to their children.